I'd like to welcome to the podcast a very special guest today, Peter Abbott, all the way from Boston, Massachusetts. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks very much, Rachel. It's a pleasure to be here.
So I understand you're the British consul for Britain, based in Boston, Massachusetts at the consulate. So can you tell us, just a little bit about what that role is and what it is that you do?
Yes, of course. It's a question I get quite a lot. I think folks don't always know exactly what diplomats do, particularly those of us who are in what we call subordinate posts. So obviously we have a British embassy in Washington, headed by our ambassador, Dame Karen Pierce. And then we have a number of consulates around the United States in major cities. And as you said, I'm based in Boston. And from Boston, I cover New England, so the 6 New England states of Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New Hampshire, Vermont, and Maine. And I am the senior British diplomat with responsibility for that area. And that means that my job is to promote Britain, promote the UK, and promote British interests. Now, those those change over time, depending on what's going on in the world and what the priorities are of the British government of the day. But at the moment, British priorities in New England are focused on things like promoting science and innovation links between universities and research institutes in the UK and the US. And obviously in Boston, we have a real wealth of higher education institutions like Harvard and MIT, Boston University, Boston College, and others. We also do a lot of work on trade and investment, so helping British companies invest or export to New England, and also helping American companies based in New England set up or export to the UK. We're doing a lot on trade. So after we left the European Union, the government in the UK has put a huge focus on trade, international global trade. And we do a lot around life sciences as well, which is really interesting. Right. Boston is one of the global sort of leads on life sciences. And as we come out of the pandemic, sharing expertise on life sciences, vaccine development and things is really important. And of course, we do lots of public diplomacy as well, just like this. And Boston and New England is such a rich area for history and historical connections to the UK that it's very easy, I think, to find lots of really, really interesting stories to talk about. And that's one of the reasons I'm so delighted to be part of this podcast.
Oh, thank you, Peter. I mean, a couple of episodes ago, I had the pleasure of interviewing Barry Cotton, and we talked about his 7 times great-grandfather, the Reverend John Cotton, who was the vicar at St. Botolph's in Boston, Lincolnshire, and that he was part of the founding of Harvard, and he died over in Boston, MA, in 1652, and came to be known as the Puritan patriarch of New England. And what was fascinating at looking at that story is it reflects exactly what you've just been explaining about your role and the things that you do within New England. And it reflects what they were looking at almost 400 years ago, setting up trading companies, setting up those links and trades between England and the New World. So some things have not changed very much, have they, in 400 years?
No, they haven't. And in fact, I have a beautiful historic residence, official residence on Beacon Hill, which is the most historic part, the oldest part of Boston. And hanging on one of my walls is a print of St. Botolph's Church in Lincolnshire as it was being built. I think it's a 14th century church. And the church is often known as Boston Stump because of its rather interestingly shaped spire. But very few people know that the word Boston, the name Boston in Lincolnshire and in Massachusetts, comes from a contraction of St. Botolph's Town. So Botolph's Town, Boston, which I think is a really interesting connection. And you're absolutely right about that trade always being this kind of constant. And it's lovely. It was really interesting to read about your voyage between the UK and Massachusetts, following the route of the Mayflower in a cargo ship, in a
Yeah.
container ship, which of course, as you pointed out, I think in one of your interviews, the Mayflower was a cargo ship, was a trading vessel
Yes.
that they used to come over here on. So it's always a constant, that idea of trade and emigration linked to trade.
Yeah, and that's reflected in Boston Lincolnshire's motto. So their motto, by sea and land. And
Mm,
then they've got this fascinating heraldic shield for their arms. So it's a black background, and it's got these three golden crowns or coronets on them. And I think they represent the three dukes of Richmond, Suffolk, and Brittany. I
mm,
think they were the major landowners of that time during the time of Henry VIII. And either side of this heraldic shield are two mermaids, and apparently the local tradition is that they signify the connection of the borough with the two women of note during that reign, and that was Anne Boleyn and Princess Mary, which was the Duchess of Suffolk. And
mm.
that by sea and by land is still, there today. There's still lots of trade. There's lots of immigration and people moving in and out of that town. So do you think that reflects Boston, Massachusetts as well? And has it got a similar motto?
Well, that's a good question. I don't know what Boston's motto is, but certainly immigration has defined this city. I mean, obviously, it was founded by English settlers, but then fairly rapidly thereafter, really grew to be defined by waves of immigration from other parts of the world. So, Irish immigration in the early 1800s. Driven in part by the tragedy of the potato famine and other reasons to compel the Irish to move to the New World.
Mm.
So that immigration in the early 1800s, there was a large Portuguese wave of emigration to Boston in the mid 1800s, largely from the Azores. And they were drawn here to Boston and to New Bedford and to other parts of Massachusetts by the whaling trade. They brought their fishing and whaling expertise from the Azores to Boston. You then, in the late 1800s, had a wave of Italian emigration, and roughly around the same time, a lot of Jewish emigration from Eastern Europe and Russia. And then in the 20th century, Haitians, Vietnamese, Cape Verdeans, and Brazilians, drawn, I think, by the Portuguese language that was already spoken in large parts of Massachusetts. So it's, and if you ask most Brits about Boston, they will think about Irish, Ireland.
Yeah.
They might think about the Italian communities, but it's a real patchwork. Actually, modern Boston reflects centuries of immigration from all different parts of the world. I think one thing that's really interesting is to look at the political control of Boston. So the last mayor was a chap called Martin Walsh, who hailed from Ireland. His family hailed from Ireland. His predecessor, Thomas Menino, his ancestors came from Italy. But we're currently in a race for who's going to be the new mayor of Boston. And there are five candidates currently in the running. One traces his roots back to Cape Verde. One traces her roots back to Poland and Tunisia. One traces her roots to Taiwan. And then two of the other candidates are Black, of African American heritage. So, the Italian and Irish dominance of politics in Boston seems to be coming to an end. And the political race for mayor is much more reflective of the kind of the modern communities, the modern makeup of immigration in Boston.
Yeah. I think I only got a few days in Boston when it was part of my travels, and and it was such a fascinating town. And getting off the airport onto the bus that traveled by road and then connected to this overhead cable, and then switched off its engines and became electrified, and then drove down into the subway, and I had no idea what was going on. But then making my way through some of the different areas through Cambridge, and then spending time on the Harvard campus, it's just there's just so much to see, and I think I was a little overwhelmed at the sheer size of Boston, and I think that's where the two Bostons differ greatly. That Boston, Lincolnshire is still quite a small place, but then Boston, Massachusetts is absolutely huge.
Well, heaven help you, Rachel, if you ever go to New York. But Boston is actually a relatively small city by American standards, and it doesn't feel that way when you arrive
No.
and get off the plane. But it's actually relatively small. But it is absolute. Every square mile of it is jam packed with history linking back to Britain and the colonial period. Being consul general in Boston, I often joke that you have to have quite broad shoulders. I'm often invited to take part in commemorative events for things that happened that weren't particularly pleasant for Britain. So either the day when the British troops evacuated Boston, the Battle of Bunker Hill, where over 1,000 British soldiers and officers were killed, the anniversary of the Boston Massacre, of course, which is credited with launching the War of Independence, the battles of Concord and Lexington, where the local American militias defeated the British Redcoats, and of course every year on the 4th of July, where they celebrate their independence from Great Britain. But through all of that, I think there is huge affection for the United Kingdom, for the role that we had in founding the colony of Massachusetts, as it was at the start, and that connection is there in sort of everyday life, and the number of people who are they're so proud to be able to trace their roots back to that the voyage of the Mayflower in 1620, and the interest around the 400th anniversary, which was last year, sadly, really disrupted because of the pandemic. But a lot of the events and things postponed to this year, and huge amount of interest in that anniversary. And I think also in the increasing awareness of the importance of the native tribes that were here when the Mayflower landed, and the relationship between those early settlers and the Wampanoag community, the Wampanoag tribe that are still here in Massachusetts, and some of the others such as the Mashpee and the Aquinnah community. So that's been a real pleasure for me to learn about that and to meet some of the folks from those communities who still live in Massachusetts today.
Yeah, I think we'll continue talking about that, because it's something that I was able to experience myself. But we're going to take a little creative break, and we're going to hear a fantastic poem by one of the Lippy women, Sheila North, about a sailor.
Anonymous Sailor, 1598 to 1621. 13 years, 13 years of blue and green and blackest foam. I was my mother's favorite, almost her only. I survived dread childhood, unlike my 7 siblings who so soon passed they could have been Mayflowers or moss. I was her sole support, my father a distant memory of big boots and large hands which smelled of the tallow he made candles with. I was 10 when I first went to sea. Now I'm 23 and dead of some foul potion of scurvy, tuberculosis, and pneumonia. I always thought I'd die at sea, not like this. See, John Howland, one of God's new Israel. Bah! The arrogance of those words. He fell overboard, but I rescued him with a rope. My hope was always simply to survive and help my mother. Instead, I'm dead in another land on a ship hardy enough to survive its masts nearly being snapped by storms. But hush, Puritans are dying too. God damn them and their buckled shoes.
Well, what a fantastic poem that was. And Sheila really just helps you picture that voyage and what it must have been like for a sailor traveling between Boston and going across the ocean. So just before we took a little break, we was talking about some of the indigenous peoples and some of the Wampanoag, the Aquinnah that are still present in Massachusetts. And when I was given permission to visit Harvard, I was just blown away by some of the collections that they've got in the Peabody. And I spent some fantastic time with Meredith, one of the collection stewards, in the archives, donning my lab coat, and I was able to take my sketchbook and pencil and sit and study some of the woven items that they have in their collection. And I just couldn't believe some of the patterns and the intricacies. And it's great that things like that in collections are still around and still accessible for people. And as an artist, being able to access these collections, it's invaluable when you're trying to cover such a complex story, such as the 2020 400th anniversary, where we're looking at, quite a lot of different nations all coming together in that story, in that celebration. And it was such a shame that a lot of it's had to be put on hold. But thankfully, my exhibition is going to be going ahead now in November. So I'll be showing the background story. But is there any sort of big events planned in Boston that should have happened last year that's going to be rescheduled for this year?
So there are lots of things, unfortunately, have just had to be scaled back because they have been postponed once, postponed twice. But I was able to visit Plymouth, Massachusetts last Friday, and take part in a very moving event focused on commemoration, reconciliation, acknowledgement. And there are a number of speakers at that event, including representatives from the Wampanoag, Mashpee, and Aquinnah tribes, as well as those representing the Mayflower descendants, of which there are, I am told, something like 30 million around the world. It's an extraordinary number, as well as local politicians from Massachusetts and from the Plymouth area. And it was quite short. It was in the middle of tropical storm Elsa, and so it was torrential rain outside. But it was lovely to be inside and to be talking with these people about the events of 400 years ago, and reflecting on the impact that landing of that ship had on so many people's lives, I think for good and for ill. And I think it is a really important part of commemorating an event like this, that we understand that there's darkness and light, I think, involved in the story, because for many, many years, I think the focus was on the light and was on literally on the sort of the city on the hill that was built in Boston as a beacon of freedom for those who felt oppressed by the religious laws in England at the time, and in other parts of the world at the time. But of course, then that freedom and that beacon turned in on itself a little bit, and freedom was denied, of course, to many others over the course of the early history of the colonies, including those who had lived on this land for centuries, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years before the settlers arrived. But that was a lovely moment last Friday in Plymouth. There will also be a maritime festival in Plymouth in early September, where the Mayflower 2, which is the reconstructed model of the Mayflower, full scale model that is moored in Plymouth Harbour, will be sailing out of the harbour and back into the harbour, which will be a lovely chance to see a ship that looks exactly like the Mayflower arrive back in Plymouth Harbour. So there'll be a huge maritime festival there, and we're hoping that something called the Mayflower Autonomous Ship, which is as it sounds, is an autonomous ship. It doesn't have any people on it. Which was built by IBM and a consortium of other folks. It's a research vessel. It's solar powered, It's doing all sorts of really interesting scientific studies, oceanographic studies, climate studies, and it is tracing the exact journey from Plymouth, England to Plymouth, Massachusetts. It hit some technical difficulties. It was supposed to have arrived over the course of the summer, but it hit some technical difficulties and unfortunately had to be towed back to Plymouth, England for repairs. But it should be arriving, we hope, in Plymouth, Massachusetts in time for that Maritime Festival to coincide with the reconstructed Mayflower 2 arriving in Plymouth. So there's lots to look forward to over the course of this year.
Isn't it funny how history repeats itself? You know,
Exactly.
the original Mayflower had so many false starts because of the speedwell being as open and leaky as a sieve, I think William Bradford put it.
Exactly.
And then you've got this new one and it's state of the art and all, you know, bells and whistles, and it ends up having the same, it still has to go back to port for some adjustments before it goes off on its voyage.
I know, no, exactly. Although I think there's some historical speculation that the captain of the Speedwell was deliberately boring holes in the hull of the ship to create the leaks because he didn't want to go on a pretty dangerous and pretty unprofitable trip. So, but I don't think the Mayflower autonomous ship was self-sabotaged in that way.
But I can understand that too. You know, I think when I was getting ready to get on the freight ship, I think it was my dad. He kept trying to buy me a ticket on a cruise ship. So you know, you'll still be crossing the Atlantic, and I just kept saying, "It's not the same, Dad.
It's not the same.
I've got to do it authentically. You know, they went on a cargo ship. That's what I've got to do. You know, I'm not going to sit and cross the Atlantic in luxury. So I need to try and get to as close as what they would have had." So, and I think if he could have gone and borne holes in that giant cargo ship, he would have done. Oh dear. Well, you know, it's fascinating when you're looking at these two cities and how similar and how different they are over that space of that 400 years. And you know, whenever people ask me about my Mayflower project and they say, "What are you doing now?" And I said, "Oh, I'm making one for Boston." They'll say, "Oh, Boston, America, you're going back over there?" And I'll go, "No, Boston, UK." Where? And I think they forget that you know, we have a Boston in Lincolnshire, you know, and it has such a rich history and such huge connections with Boston MA. So hopefully this has gone a little way to try and encourage people to sort of look at these two cities in a different light. So just before we finish off, if there's any websites or things of interest that you'd like to point listeners to go and check out on the web, then is there anything that you would suggest?
Well, I would certainly, there are a variety of organisations in England and in Massachusetts that are celebrating the 400th anniversary. So the Plymouth 400 website, I think, in the UK is full of really, really interesting stuff, including stories about one of my favourite projects, which is the creation of a new wampum belt. Wampum belts were used by the Wampanoag tribe to tell the story and to tell the traditions of their community. The belts were made of shells woven together, and through symbols and images woven into the design, the belts were used to tell the story of the tribe. And over the last year or so, a new wampum belt has been created in the UK, drawing on some of the skills and memories of living members of the Wampanoag tribe. And that belt has been on tour around the UK, and you can see some of that on the Plymouth 400 website, I think. But there's also a Mayflower 400 team here in Massachusetts who've been doing similar work. And I think they have a website as well that your listeners can go to find out more about the American side of things. I should also say that we've been talking about a four-nation approach to this, not just England, not just America, but also the Wampanoag Nation that we've talked about already, but also the Dutch. We mustn't forget the role that the Netherlands played in this visit and in this voyage, and the fact that a number of the pilgrims actually lived in Leiden for a period of time before moving on to the United States. So we've been looking at it as a sort of a four-nation commemoration.
Yeah. Excellent. Well, thank you. Well, thank you so much, Peter, for taking the time to chat with me today, and for being such a wonderful guest.
It's my pleasure. And Rachel, your Pilgrim Women series is fantastic, and I hope those of your listeners who haven't encountered them already will be able to do so soon.
Oh, thank you. Spirit of Mayflower is part of a series celebrating my Spirit of Mayflower project. You can get involved in lots of ways. You can take a look at some of the movies and pictures I took on my journey by heading to the Rachel Carter Sculpture Facebook page. You can also head to my website at www.rachelcarter.co.uk, and there you'll be able to view some of the sculptures I make, treat yourself to a limited edition Pilgrim Woman sculpture, or take a look at some of the online tutorials.
On the tide, with a cargo full of hopes and dreams and 100 souls inside, we're crossing the great ocean, we're riding on the tide, with a cargo full of